Today, we delve into the life of a figure as controversial as he is enigmatic, Wetzel. Celebrated in his time for his unmatched skills as a frontiersman and his seemingly ever-ready rifle, Wetzel's relentless campaigns against Native Americans made him a hero to some and a figure of horror in the modern lens. He embodies the duality of early American history, both a symbol of unyielding frontier resilience and, by today's standards, a perpetrator of unbridled violence. Wetzel's story unfolds in the turbulent northern Ohio River Valley during the late 18th century, a region steeped in conflict and contradiction. Born in 1763, the same year King George III issued the Proclamation of 1763 to halt colonial expansion west of the Appalachian Mountains and preserve native lands, Wetzel grew up in a world defined by defiance of such orders. Settlers, driven by dreams of prosperity, disregarded the proclamation, seeing the fertile lands of Ohio and West Virginia as opportunities for new beginnings. Yet, these territories were far from unclaimed. They were the homelands of indigenous peoples, notably the Shawnee, who fiercely resisted the encroachment. Wetzel's family exemplified this frontier defiance, establishing roots in 1770 near present-day Wheeling, West Virginia, on the eastern bank of the Ohio River. This river became both a physical and symbolic divide. American settlers dominated the east, while indigenous tribes such as the Shawnee defended the west. Life in this fraught borderland was marked by uneasy coexistence and escalating tensions, which erupted violently with the advent of the American Revolution in 1775. As the revolution began, many Native American tribes, disillusioned by the prospect of American rule, aligned with the British, who at least professed a commitment to protecting native lands. For settlers in Wheeling, this alliance meant a surge in retaliatory raids, deepening the entrenched hostility between the two sides. The settlers, however, were not blameless. Frontier aggression culminated in events such as the 1778 murder of Chief Cornstalk, a revered Shawnee leader, during a tense but peaceful visit to Fort Randolph. This act of betrayal left a profound scar on both the Shawnee and settler communities, fueling a relentless cycle of vengeance. By 1778, as the violence escalated, a young Wetzel was thrust into the chaos of frontier life. His early experiences of brutality and survival on the fringes of civilization would forge him into a man emblematic of the era's harsh realities, a figure defined by the tumultuous and often merciless world in which he lived. Around the age of 14, while working on the family farm with his younger brother, Wetzel's life took a dramatic and violent turn. A group of Native American warriors emerged from the forest, a harbinger of the tensions that had already gripped the region. Acting on instinct, Wetzel seized his father's rifle, a reflex that proved critical as the family had been on edge due to a series of recent raids. During the struggle, a shot fired by one of the warriors grazed Wetzel's chest, leaving him wounded but not incapacitated. Despite his injury, the brothers were captured and taken across the Ohio River, entering a period of harrowing uncertainty. For 2 nights, they faced the grim possibility of being killed, tortured, or even adopted into the tribe, a fate common for captives of the time, but no less terrifying. On the second night, the brothers executed a daring escape, displaying uncanny courage and resourcefulness. Wetzel not only led their flight, but also crept back into the camp to retrieve his father's rifle and a pair of moccasins for their journey home. Their return to their settlement was met with astonishment, as the community had assumed them lost forever. This episode marked a turning point for Wetzel, igniting a deep-seated hatred for Native Americans that would drive his actions for the rest of his life. By age 15, Wetzel was already engaging in violent confrontations. On one occasion, a group of frontiersmen sought his help in retrieving horses allegedly stolen by a native group. During the pursuit, Wetzel found himself cornered and outnumbered by 2 warriors. Relying on his wits, he used a stick to hold his hat out from behind a tree, drawing their fire. With the warriors distracted, Wetzel struck, killing both men and scalping them, an act that cemented his growing notoriety. Scalping, though gruesome, was a widespread practice on the frontier, often incentivized by government-issued bounties. One such bounty, $100 for a native he killed, was reportedly given by Wetzel to a girl he fancied so she could purchase household goods. While this act might hint at a softer side, it did nothing to temper his increasing obsession with violence and vengeance. By the time he was 17, Wetzel had joined local militias as a scout. This unpaid and perilous role required him to track native movements, ambush hostile parties, and defend frontier settlements. Scouts were expected to provide their own weapons and supplies, but for Wetzel, the role was a calling. His reputation as a relentless and lethal tracker quickly spread, making him both feared and revered in the borderlands. Physically, Wetzel cut an imposing figure. Standing nearly 6 feet tall with a muscular build, he was a towering presence on the frontier. However, his most striking feature was his hair, long, dark, and never cut. It extended nearly to his calves when brushed out, a deliberate choice laden with symbolism. Wetzel believed that one day he would be killed by a native warrior, and the length of his hair represented the scalping trophy he assumed would be taken from him in death. This act of defiance and vanity was both a testament to his prowess and a challenge to his enemies. What truly set Wetzel apart, though, was his extraordinary skill with a rifle. He had mastered the rare and formidable ability to reload while running, a feat that gave him a lethal edge in skirmishes. This combination of physical strength, skill, and ruthless determination made Wetzel a figure of both legend and infamy on the volatile American frontier. In an era when muzzle-loading rifles demanded a meticulous, multi-step reloading process, Wetzel's mastery of reloading on the run became his hallmark, securing his place in frontier legend. This exceptional skill proved crucial during a disastrous 1782 expedition led by Colonel William Crawford into the Ohio Territory. The mission, intended to destroy native villages to deter attacks on American settlements, ended in disaster. Crawford and many of his men were captured, tortured, and executed, but Wetzel managed to escape. His escape became a harrowing testament to his endurance and tactical prowess. While returning home with his companion, John Mills, Wetzel's skill was tested yet again. Ambushed by a group of native warriors, Mills was fatally shot, leaving Wetzel to face their pursuers alone. Outnumbered and relentlessly chased, Wetzel fled through the forest, pausing only to fire back at his attackers. He managed to kill one warrior, reloading his rifle mid-sprint, an ability that bewildered his enemies. They hesitated in awe, calling out in disbelief at his seemingly endless ammunition. This uncanny skill birthed the phrase, "His gun always loaded," a refrain that would immortalize Wetzel in frontier folklore. A life fueled by revenge and hatred. Wetzel's life as a scout and Indian hunter became a relentless pursuit of vengeance. His hatred for Native Americans was deeply personal, further inflamed by repeated family tragedies. In 1786, Wetzel endured a devastating ambush along the Ohio River, during which his father, John, his brother, George, and even the family dog were killed. That same year, his sister Christina died during another raid. These losses pushed Wetzel into a realm of violence that surpassed even the brutal norms of the frontier. Wetzel's actions grew increasingly ruthless and unprovoked. In one infamous incident, he infiltrated a native camp at night and killed 2 sleeping men, later lamenting that he failed to eliminate a third target. On another occasion, he and his friend Jonathan Zane tracked down and killed 5 native men, collecting their scalps as trophies. Wetzel's methods were as merciless as his motives, and while his contemporaries were no strangers to violence, few shared his unrelenting bloodlust. Even prominent frontiersmen like Simon Kenton, who also clashed with Native Americans, expressed regret after killing in cold blood. Kenton once mourned the unnecessary death of a subdued Shawnee warrior, a stark contrast to Wetzel's view of Native Americans as an eternal enemy. This perspective defined his identity and set him apart as one of the most polarizing figures of the frontier. Infamy and consequences. Between 1779 and 1788, Wetzel was believed to have killed at least 27 Native Americans, though some accounts suggest his tally exceeded 100. His rifle stock bore more than 20 notches, each presumed to represent a life he had taken. Despite his mounting death toll, Wetzel faced little opposition from his peers or authorities, at least initially. However, in 1788, Wetzel's actions finally drew the attention of military leadership at Fort Harmar in Marietta, Ohio. General Josiah Harmar, aware of Wetzel's reputation, ordered him to abstain from interfering in ongoing peace negotiations with Seneca Chief Tecumseh. The military sought to prevent Wetzel's volatile presence from derailing delicate diplomacy. True to form, Wetzel remained defiant, uninterested in peace, and unwilling to relinquish his self-imposed mission of vengeance. Wetzel's legacy, both celebrated and condemned, encapsulates the brutal complexities of frontier life. He was a man shaped by his era's violent ethos, his actions a reflection of both personal trauma and the larger conflicts that defined the early American frontier. Ignoring General Harmar's explicit orders, Lewis Wetzel ambushed Seneca Chief Tecumseh along a roadside, shooting and scalping him. Although Tecumseh survived the initial attack and later identified Wetzel as his assailant, Wetzel was utterly unrepentant. His actions were fueled by an unyielding hatred for Native Americans, dismissing any notion of peaceful coexistence. The attack created a scandal. Harmar, enraged by Wetzel's defiance and the potential repercussions for ongoing peace efforts, ordered his arrest. For one of the few times in his life, Wetzel faced legal consequences. Despite Harmar's efforts, Wetzel's frontier reputation as a hero shielded him. Settlers rallied to his defense, framing his actions as justified retaliation for the violence and hardships they had endured. They argued that Wetzel, through his actions, embodied their fears, frustrations, and survival instincts. Before a trial could be held, Wetzel's supporters orchestrated a jailbreak, freeing him and erasing any trace of formal justice. Afterward, he disappeared for a time, effectively evading further scrutiny. The incident, however, deepened divisions. To some, Wetzel remained a folk hero, a symbol of unrelenting frontier resilience. To others, his unchecked brutality highlighted the darker side of settler expansion, fostering doubts about the moral cost of their cause. The stories of Wetzel's exploits, both real and exaggerated, spread widely. Songs, tales, and even art immortalized him as one of the frontier's most controversial figures, a man straddling the line between hero and villain. Wetzel's legacy and the moral complexity of the frontier. Lewis Wetzel's legacy reveals the brutal and morally fraught nature of life on the early American frontier. His unyielding hatred, pursuit of vengeance, and capacity for violence reflected the survival instincts of many settlers who lived under the constant threat of attack. For settlers often caught in cycles of violence, Wetzel's actions were not viewed as barbaric, but as necessary in a world where survival often demanded adopting the ruthless tactics of their enemies. To his admirers, Wetzel symbolized the indomitable spirit of the frontier, a figure akin to Daniel Boone or Simon Kenton, though his motivations were deeply rooted in revenge rather than exploration or diplomacy. Yet Wetzel's life also represents the darker aspects of this expansion. Where Boone and Kenton are remembered for their efforts at negotiation and mutual respect with native tribes, Wetzel's name is synonymous with unrelenting violence. His personal vendetta against Native Americans overshadowed any broader cause, making him a divisive figure even among his contemporaries. Historians have noted that Wetzel's story exemplifies the scars left by the cycles of raids, counter-raids, and revenge killings that defined the colonial and early American frontier. These endless retaliations devastated both settlers and native nations, leaving little room for peace. For tribes such as the Shawnee and Delaware, Wetzel was more than an individual. He was a symbol of the broader campaign of violence, land theft, and cultural disruption that decimated their populations and way of life. The limits of the legend. While Wetzel is celebrated in some circles as a heroic defender of the frontier, his story underscores the tragic costs of unchecked violence and hatred. For settlers, he was a larger-than-life figure whose actions epitomized their struggle for survival. For Native Americans, he represented the brutal dispossession of their land and lives. Wetzel's legend, as enduring as it is polarizing, offers a stark reminder of the human toll of frontier expansion, a tale of resilience intertwined with a deep and lasting tragedy. As Louis Wetzel grew older, his infamous reputation continued to cast a long shadow, though the thrill and allure of his violent exploits began to fade. The untamed frontier was gradually yielding to civilization as settlements expanded and towns emerged. By the early 1790s, federal policies emphasized structured relations with native nations, and state leaders sought to curb the violence that had defined the frontier for decades. Wetzel, however, found himself at odds with this new era of order and diplomacy. A man shaped by a time of unchecked frontier brutality, he struggled to adapt. The vengeance that had once consumed him seemed exhausted, but the transition to a peaceful life proved elusive. By 1791, Wetzel had drifted westward in search of new opportunities and perhaps a fresh start. He attempted to assimilate into the evolving frontier society, venturing into the Louisiana Territory. There, he briefly enlisted in military campaigns against the Spanish, hoping to rediscover a sense of purpose. Yet his past trailed him like a shadow, and the life of violence he had led left little room for satisfaction in his new endeavors. Wetzel's relentless quest for conflict had rendered him purposeless in a rapidly changing world. Final years and death in his later years, Wetzel's life slowed considerably, but his mental and physical health declined. Accounts suggest that he struggled with physical ailments and perhaps psychological scars, haunted by the countless lives he had taken. His early impulsive choices and extreme acts of violence seemed to weigh heavily on him. By the 1790s, he had journeyed to the Spanish-controlled Louisiana Territory, a region rife with colonial rivalries and sporadic clashes. Here, he likely sought to escape his dark reputation and the growing disdain from settlers who had begun to frown upon his unyielding hatred for Native Americans. Despite crossing into new territories, Wetzel remained tethered to his reputation as a legendary Indian fighter. Though he briefly joined militia forces in Spanish Louisiana, he never recaptured the notoriety or sense of purpose he once had on the Ohio frontier. By 1808, his health had deteriorated significantly. Alone, far from the settlements that once celebrated him as a hero, Wetzel died at age 45 in Natchez, Mississippi. His death was unremarkable, without ceremony or recognition for his tumultuous life of violence. Buried in an unmarked grave, Wetzel faded into obscurity, as though history itself sought to soften or erase the brutal legacy he left behind. The controversial legacy of Louis Wetzel today. Wetzel remains a deeply polarizing figure. For some, he is remembered as a heroic defender of the frontier, a man who protected settlers from hostile attacks and embodied the rugged individualism and resilience of early America. His exploits became the stuff of legend, immortalized in frontier folklore, songs, and even novels. Generations of settlers celebrated his deeds and stories, portraying him as a fearless, uncompromising protector, akin to figures like Davy Crockett or Paul Bunyan, though his legend carried a far darker tone. Modern historians, however, view Wetzel through a more critical lens. They see him as a tragic figure, consumed by hatred and unable, or unwilling, to envision a world of coexistence. His life was defined by a single-minded vendetta against Native Americans, which overshadowed any capacity for empathy or reconciliation. Wetzel's story is a cautionary tale of the corrosive power of hatred and the devastating cost of perpetual violence. His actions reflect the harsh realities of the American frontier, a time when clashes between settlers and native tribes were frequent, brutal, and often devoid of mercy. Wetzel's legacy compels us to confront uncomfortable truths about America's past, raising questions about the cycles of vengeance and the human cost of westward expansion. His story, celebrated by some and condemned by others, remains a stark reminder of the moral ambiguities that define the birth of a nation. The stories of figures like Louis Wetzel compel us to confront the profound costs of westward expansion, not only on Native Americans, whose lands and lives were ravaged, but also on the settlers who enacted and endured the violence. Living under constant threat in a hostile and uncertain environment, settlers were drawn into unending cycles of retribution that left lasting scars on both sides. Figures like Wetzel personified this relentless hostility, serving as stark reminders of the sacrifices made and the moral compromises that defined the era. While some still view Wetzel as a symbol of frontier courage and resilience, others see him as an embodiment of the darkest chapters of America's frontier history. Louis Wetzel in perspective. Ultimately, the life of Louis Wetzel resists simple classification. He was, above all, a product of his time, a man molded by the hardships of an era that often demanded violence as a means of survival. His actions, frequently indefensible, speak volumes about a society steeped in fear, where the line between survival and savagery was often blurred. Wetzel's life reflects a frontier where fear, hatred, and hope collided, creating a world that offered little room for mercy or compassion. Wetzel's relentless hatred and acts of violence illustrate the dangerous power of dehumanization. To him, Native Americans were not individuals, but enemies to be eradicated, a mindset born of the intense pressures and prejudices of frontier life. His story reveals the human toll of such a worldview, both on those who lived by it and those who suffered because of it. It serves as a cautionary tale about the corrosive effects of hatred and the ethical complexities that arise during times of extreme conflict. The legacy of Louis Wetzel. Wetzel's legacy endures as a complex symbol of the American frontier, marked by both its brutal realities and its enduring myths. His life reminds us of the challenges, sacrifices, and bitter conflicts that accompanied America's westward expansion. Yet it also forces us to reckon with the devastating impact of these clashes on Native Americans, whose communities were decimated, and on settlers, who bore the psychological scars of constant violence. In the end, Wetzel's story is a reminder of the profound human costs of conquest, survival, and vengeance. His name stands as a testament to a turbulent and often merciless chapter in American history, urging us to remember the moral complexities of the past while reflecting on the consequences of unchecked fear and hatred.